In the unforgiving desert of Arizona Territory in 1872, where the line between civilization and wilderness was drawn in blood and bullets, a single act of mercy would shatter everything two sworn enemies believed about each other. When Martha Henderson found a dying Apache warrior collapsed near her well, she faced a choice that would change both their lives forever. What began as a moment of compassion would become a story of survival, forbidden love, and the courage to defy an entire world that demanded they remain enemies. This is the true story of how a grieving widow and a wounded raider discovered that humanity could triumph over hatred, even when it cost them everything they had ever known. Martha Henderson wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carried the heavy wooden bucket toward the well behind her small adobe house. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty ground, creating waves of heat that made the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. It was the kind of morning that reminded her why most sensible folks call this territory godforsaken land, fit only for scorpions and Apache warriors. She had been living alone on this isolated homestead for 8 months now, ever since her husband Thomas was killed during a raid on their neighbor's ranch. The Apache had swept down from the hills like ghosts, striking fast and disappearing just as quickly into the rocky canyons that honeycombed the landscape. Thomas had been helping the Richardsons bring in their cattle when the war party attacked. He died with a rifle in his hands, trying to protect women and children he barely knew. The territorial authorities had urged Martha to abandon the homestead and move into town, where there were soldiers and safety in numbers. But she refused to leave. This patch of desert was all she had left of the life she and Thomas had built together. They had scratched out their existence here for 3 years, fighting drought, flash floods, and the constant threat of Apache raids. She would not let his death be meaningless by simply walking away. As Martha approached the well, she noticed something that made her freeze in her tracks. There, collapsed against the stone wall of the well, was a man. But this was not one of the few neighbors who might have wandered onto her property seeking help. The long black hair, the bronze skin, and the distinctive clothing told her immediately what he was. An Apache warrior lay unconscious in her yard, blood seeping from wounds in his chest and leg. Her first instinct was to run back to the house and grab Thomas's rifle. This would be a trap. Apache warriors were known for their cunning, and using a wounded decoy to lure unsuspecting settlers into ambush was exactly the kind of tactics they employed. Martha's heart pounded as she scanned the surrounding rocks and scrub brush, looking for signs of other warriors lying in wait. But as she watched the still figure by the well, she began to notice things that contradicted her fears. The blood pooling beneath him was fresh and bright red. His breathing was shallow and labored, the kind that came with serious injury, not pretense. One of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. No warrior would voluntarily subject himself to such genuine injuries just to create a convincing decoy. Martha stood there for long minutes, torn between caution and something else she could not quite name. This was her enemy, a member of the same tribe that had killed her husband. By all logic, she should let him die, or better yet, finish him off herself. It would be justice of a sort, and certainly safer for her in the long run. Yet something held her back. Perhaps it was the way his face looked peaceful in unconsciousness, younger than she had expected. He could not be more than 25 years old, barely older than Thomas had been when they married. Or perhaps it was the small medicine bundle she could see tied to his belt, which reminded her that he was not just a faceless enemy, but a real person with beliefs and family somewhere in those distant mountains. Moving carefully, Martha approached the well. The warrior did not stir as she drew closer, confirming her assessment that he was genuinely unconscious, not lying in ambush. She knelt beside him and examined his wounds more closely. The chest wound appeared to be from a gunshot, probably a rifle bullet that had passed through without hitting anything vital. The leg was definitely broken, but the bone had not torn through the skin. Both wounds were serious, but not immediately fatal if treated properly. As she studied his injuries, Martha found herself wondering how he had ended up here. Her homestead was at least 20 miles from the nearest Apache stronghold in the mountains, and much farther from the reservation where the government insisted all Apache should live. He must have traveled a long distance while wounded, probably seeking water from her well. The fact that he had made it this far spoke to remarkable strength and determination. Without quite realizing she had made a decision, Martha found herself checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady. His skin felt hot to the touch, suggesting the beginning of fever from infection. If she was going to help him, it would have to be soon. Once fever took hold, even the strongest man could die quickly in this heat. But helping him would mean bringing an Apache warrior into her home, the same home where she had mourned her husband's death at Apache hands. It would mean risking her own safety on the uncertain hope that he would not kill her once he recovered. It would mean defying everything she had been taught about Apache being irredeemable savages who showed no mercy and deserved none in return. Martha stood up and looked around her property once more. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. The closest army patrol might not pass this way for weeks. If she turned her back on this wounded man and let him die, no one would ever know. She could drag his body into the desert and let the scavengers take care of the evidence. It would be the practical thing to do, the safe thing to do. Instead, she found herself walking back to the house to get clean bandages and her late husband's medical kit. Thomas had served as a field medic during the war between the states, and he had taught her basic treatment for gunshot wounds and broken bones. She had never expected to use those skills on Apache warrior, but life had a way of presenting unexpected situations. When she returned to the well, the warrior was still unconscious. Martha cleaned his wounds as best she could and bandaged them with strips of clean cotton. She fashioned a splint for his broken leg using wooden slats from a broken crate. The whole time she worked, she kept Thomas's pistol within easy reach, just in case. Moving an unconscious man who was larger and heavier than herself proved to be the most difficult part. Martha had to drag him on a blanket across the yard to her house, stopping frequently to rest. By the time she had him inside and settled on the spare cot in her small back room, she was exhausted and having serious second thoughts about what she had done. She sat in her kitchen chair, staring at the closed door that separated her from the sleeping Apache warrior, and wondered if she had just signed her own death warrant. Every story she had ever heard about Apache cruelty ran through her mind. Tales of settlers tortured to death, of women and children carried off into slavery, of whole families wiped out in raids that left nothing but burned ruins and scattered bones. But she also remembered something Thomas had told her once, something he had heard from an old trapper who had lived among various Indian tribes. "They're not demons, Martha," he had said. "They're just people trying to survive in a world that keeps changing on them. They fight us because we're taking their land, and they know if they don't fight, they'll have nothing left." At the time, she had dismissed his words as the romantic notions of a man who had never actually faced Apache raiders. Now, with one of those raiders lying wounded in her back room, she wondered if Thomas might have been wiser than she had given him credit for. This warrior had not chosen to collapse at her well. Circumstance had brought him here, just as circumstance had brought her to the choice of whether to help or harm him. As evening approached, Martha prepared a simple meal and wondered whether she should try to give the warrior some water. He had been unconscious for hours now, and fever was definitely setting in. She had seen enough wounded men during Thomas's recovery from his own war wounds to know that dehydration could kill as surely as bullets. She opened the door to the back room cautiously, holding a cup of water and a cloth for cooling his fever. The warrior lay exactly as she had left him, breathing slowly but regularly. In the dim light filtering through the small window, his face looked peaceful, almost boyish. It was hard to reconcile this sleeping figure with the terrifying raiders of her nightmares. Martha dampened the cloth and placed it on his forehead, then gently lifted his head to try trickling a small amount of water between his lips. To her surprise, he swallowed reflexively, some primal survival instinct working even in unconsciousness. She gave him a little more water, then settled back to watch and wait. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, a sound that always reminded her how alone she was out here. Tonight, the loneliness felt different. She was not quite alone anymore, though her companion was hardly what anyone would call ideal company. She had taken in a wounded enemy, gambling her life on the hope that mercy might be met with mercy in return. As the hours passed, and the warrior continued to sleep, Martha found herself thinking about the choices that had led to this moment. Her decision to stay on the homestead after Thomas's death. Her choice to approach the well despite seeing the Apache warrior. Her determination to treat his wounds rather than leave him to die. Each decision had seemed to follow naturally from the one before, but now she wondered if she was acting from wisdom or foolishness. The night was fully dark when she finally allowed herself to doze in the chair beside his cot. She kept the pistol in her lap, and her ears alert for any change in his breathing or movement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, assuming he survived the night. Tomorrow she would have to decide what to do with a conscious Apache warrior in her home, and he would have to decide what to do about the white woman who had saved his life. But for now, in the quiet darkness of the desert night, there was only the sound of two people breathing, one white and one Apache, both far from where they had expected to find themselves. Martha Henderson had crossed a line she could never uncross, and morning would reveal whether her act of mercy had been the beginning of something unprecedented or the last mistake she would ever make. Martha woke with a start to find sunlight streaming through the small window of her kitchen. She had dozed off in the chair sometime before dawn, and her neck ached from sleeping at an awkward angle. The pistol was still in her lap, and for a moment she felt disoriented, unable to remember why she had been sleeping armed in a chair instead of her own bed. Then she heard a sound from the back room that made everything come rushing back. A low groan, the sound of someone in pain, but definitely conscious. The Apache warrior was waking up. Martha rose quietly from her chair, checking to make sure the pistol was loaded and ready. She had no idea what to expect when she opened that door. Would he try to attack her immediately? Would he be grateful for her help? Would he even understand that she had helped him rather than simply captured him while he was unconscious? She approached the door slowly, listening to the sounds from within. She could hear movement, the rustle of blankets, and what sounded like someone trying to sit up. Then came a sharp intake of breath, probably as he discovered his injuries and the pain they caused. This was followed by silence, the kind of complete stillness that suggested someone was trying to figure out where they were and how they had gotten there. Taking a deep breath, Martha opened the door and stepped into the doorway, keeping the pistol visible but not directly aimed at him. The warrior was indeed sitting up on the cot, examining the bandages on his chest with obvious confusion. When he heard the door open, his head snapped up and his eyes met hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Martha found herself looking into dark brown eyes that showed intelligence, wariness, and something that might have been curiosity. There was no immediate hostility in his gaze, which surprised her. She had expected rage, or the kind of cold hatred she had seen in the eyes of captured Apache warriors brought into the settlements. Instead, he seemed to be studying her as carefully as she was studying him, trying to piece together the circumstances that had led to this unlikely situation. His gaze moved from her face to the pistol in her hands, then to the clean bandages on his wounds, then back to her face. She could almost see him working through the logical progression. He had been wounded. She had found him. She had treated his injuries instead of killing him or letting him die. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from fever and dehydration, but the words were clear English. "You are the woman who lives here alone." It was not a question, but a statement, and Martha realized with a chill that he had been watching her homestead, probably for some time. This was not a chance encounter. He had known about her isolated situation, which meant his presence here might not be as accidental as she had assumed. "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. "And you're Apache." He nodded slowly. "I'm called Shadow Walker among my people. You have treated my wounds." "Why?" The directness of the question caught Martha off guard. She had expected threats or demands, not philosophical inquiry. "I don't know," she answered honestly. It seemed like the right thing to do. Shadow Walker considered this answer for a moment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Your husband was killed by Apache warriors. I have watched you grieve at his grave, yet you helped one of his enemies. This is strange behavior for a white woman." The fact that he had been observing her even during her most private moments of grief made Martha angry, but she forced herself to remain calm. "How long have you been watching me?" "Many weeks. We watch all the settlements, all the lone houses. It is necessary for our survival. But I have never seen a white woman live alone with such determination. Most would have fled after their man was killed." There was something in his tone that might have been respect, though Martha could not be sure. "This is my home. I won't be driven away by fear. Fear is wise when it keeps you alive. Courage without wisdom is just another name for foolishness." Shadow Walker shifted position on the cot and winced as his broken leg reminded him of its condition. But perhaps there is wisdom in your courage that I do not yet understand. Martha was struck by the thoughtful way he spoke, so different from the savage brutality she had been taught to expect from Apache warriors. You speak English very well. I spent 2 years at the reservation school when I was a boy, before my father took me away. The white teachers wanted to turn us into copies of white men, but they also taught us your language and your ways of thinking. Knowledge of one's enemy is always valuable. The casual way he referred to her as his enemy sent a chill through Martha, but she noticed that he had not made any threatening moves despite being obviously weak from his injuries. Am I your enemy now? Even though I help you? Shadow Walker was quiet for a long time, studying her face as if looking for clues to some puzzle he was trying to solve. I do not know what you are, he said finally. You are not what I expected a white settler woman to be. You show mercy to an enemy. You risk your own safety to help someone who could kill you. These are not the actions of a typical white person. Maybe you don't know white people as well as you think you do. Perhaps. Or perhaps you are not a typical white person. He paused, then asked a question that surprised her with its bluntness. Are you planning to turn me over to the soldiers when I am strong enough to travel? Martha had not really thought that far ahead, but she realized it was a reasonable question from his perspective. I haven't decided what I'm going to do. An honest answer. I appreciate honesty, even when it is not comforting. Shadow Walker lay back down on the cot, clearly exhausted by even this brief conversation. I will not try to escape until my leg heals enough to travel. Running on a broken leg would be suicide in this desert. You have time to decide my fate. The matter-of-fact way he accepted his temporary helplessness impressed Martha, despite herself. There was a dignity in his manner that contrasted sharply with everything she had been told about Apache prisoners. Most of the stories described them as either defiant to the point of self-destruction or completely broken by capture. Shadow Walker seemed to be neither. Are you hungry? She asked, surprising herself at the question. You haven't eaten in at least 2 days. I could eat if you have food to spare, but I will understand if you prefer to let hunger weaken me further. It would be the practical thing to do. Martha left the room without responding and returned a few minutes later with a bowl of thin soup made from beef broth and vegetables. She had made it weak enough that his stomach could handle it after days without food. As she helped him sit up to eat, she found herself wondering about the circumstances that had led to his injuries. How were you wounded? She asked as he sipped the soup slowly. Soldiers. A patrol found our camp 3 days ago. We scattered into the mountains, but I was hit during the fighting. I made it this far before the blood loss and broken leg stopped me. Were others hurt? Shadow Walker gave her a sharp look. You ask many questions for someone who claims not to have decided what to do with me. I am curious. I've never talked to an Apache warrior before, and I have never been treated kindly by a white settler. We are both in unfamiliar territory. He finished the soup and handed the empty bowl back to her. Thank you. The food helps. Martha took the bowl and stood to leave, but Shadow Walker's voice stopped her at the door. The woman Martha Henderson, wife of Thomas Henderson, aged 26, originally from Kansas Territory. You buried your husband on the hill behind this house 8 months ago. You grow vegetables in a small garden and keep 3 chickens and a milk cow. You read books in the evening and sometimes sing while you work. These are the things I know about you from watching. The detailed knowledge of her private life made Martha's skin crawl, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. What else do you know? I know you cry sometimes when you think no one can see. I know you're lonely, but too proud to admit it. I know you have more courage than most men I have fought against. He paused, then added more quietly, and I know you could have let me die by that well, but you chose not to. This tells me there are things about you that cannot be learned by watching from a distance. Martha left the room without responding, but his words stayed with her as she went about her daily chores. The idea that she had been observed so closely for so long was deeply disturbing, yet she found herself oddly impressed by the accuracy of his observations. He had seen details about her life and personality that she would not have expected a casual observer to notice. As the day progressed, she found herself thinking about their conversation. Shadow Walker was not at all what she had expected an Apache warrior to be. He was thoughtful, well-spoken, and seemed to possess a code of honor that governed his behavior even in captivity. This did not match the savage stereotype she had grown up believing. That evening, she brought him another meal and fresh water for cleaning his wounds. The fever was breaking, which was a good sign for his recovery. As she changed his bandages, she noticed that he watched her hands with apparent fascination. "You have gentle hands," he observed. "My grandmother had hands like that. She was a healer among our people. What happened to her?" "She died on the reservation. The white man's diseases killed many of the old ones. Grandmother said the spirits could not find us in that place, so we had no protection from sickness." His voice carried a sadness that reminded Martha of her own grief. "She taught me that healing is a sacred act, regardless of who needs it. Perhaps that is why you helped me. Perhaps your spirit recognizes the sacredness of healing." Martha found his explanation strangely comforting, though she was not sure she believed in spirits the way he did. "I'm not a healer. I just know basic medical care that my husband taught me. Knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. Your husband may have taught you the knowledge, but the wisdom to use it on an enemy came from somewhere deeper." Shadow Walker was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What was your husband like?" The question surprised Martha. She had not expected him to be curious about Thomas. He was a good man. Kind, hardworking, honest. He believed people should help each other regardless of their differences. "He sounds like a man worthy of your grief. It is a tragedy that he died in the fighting between our peoples." The simple acknowledgement of her loss, spoken without defensiveness or justification, touched Martha more deeply than she had expected. No one since Thomas's death had simply recognized her grief without trying to turn it into anger against all Apache people. "He would have helped you too," she said quietly. "If he had found you by the well instead of me, he would have done the same thing. Then, perhaps his death was a greater loss than I understood when I heard of it. Men who would show mercy to their enemies are rare in any people." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Shadow Walker spoke again. "I will be strong enough to travel in perhaps 10 days, maybe less. You will need to decide before then what you want to do." "I know." Martha gathered up the medical supplies and prepared to leave. "Rest now. Your body needs sleep to heal." As she reached the door, Shadow Walker called her name. "Martha Henderson, when the time comes for you to decide, remember that mercy given can create bonds stronger than those broken by violence. Your kindness to me will not be forgotten, regardless of what you choose to do." That night, Martha lay in her own bed thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, her biggest concerns had been whether her vegetables would survive the late summer heat and whether she had enough supplies to last until the next trip to town. Now she had an Apache warrior recovering in her spare room, and she was faced with decisions that could affect both their lives in ways she could not predict. She thought about Shadow Walker's words regarding mercy and bonds stronger than violence. There was truth in what he said, but there was also danger. Every day, she kept him here increased the risk that other Apache would come looking for him, or that soldiers would discover what she was doing. Either scenario could end very badly for both of them. Yet she found herself reluctant to simply turn him over to the authorities. The man she had talked with today bore little resemblance to the savage enemy she had been taught to fear. He was intelligent, honorable in his own way, and possessed of a dignity that demanded respect. Handing him over to soldiers who would likely execute him or ship him off to a distant reservation felt like betraying the trust that had somehow developed between them. As sleep finally came, Martha realized that her decision was already being made, not through rational planning, but through the slow building of understanding between two people who had every reason to be enemies, but were discovering they might be something else entirely. Over the next several days, Martha found her daily routine changing in ways she had not anticipated. What had begun as simple medical care for a wounded enemy was evolving into something more complex. Shadow Walker proved to be a patient who asked for little, but observed everything with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to survival, depending on understanding his environment. On the third day of his recovery, Martha entered his room to find him examining the small collection of books on a shelf by the window. Thomas had been an educated man who valued reading, and he had managed to accumulate nearly 24 volumes despite the practical challenges of frontier life. "You have many books for a frontier home," Shadow Walker observed as she set down his breakfast. "Most white settlers I have seen care only for practical things. My husband believed that books were practical. He said they contained the wisdom of people who had lived before us and faced problems similar to ours." Martha glanced at the titles he had been studying. "Can you read them?" "Some. The reservation school taught me to read simple English, but these books use many words I do not know." He picked up a volume of poetry, and examined it curiously. "What is this one about?" Martha looked at the book he held. It was a collection of Walt Whitman's poetry that Thomas had particularly enjoyed. It's poetry, thoughts, and feelings expressed in beautiful language. Like the songs our people sing around the fire, but written down instead of spoken. Something like that, yes. Martha found herself intrigued by the comparison. Do Apache people have written language? No. Our history, our songs, our wisdom all live in memory and voice. When an elder dies, all the knowledge in his mind dies with him unless he has passed it on to others. It is one reason why the white man's schools trouble us. They teach our children to value written words more than spoken ones, and slowly our own ways are forgotten. The sadness in his voice made Martha think about the books surrounding them in a new way. "Would you like me to read to you? It might help pass the time while you recover." Shadow Walker's surprise was evident on his face. "You would do that? Why not? I enjoy reading aloud, and you're curious about the books. It seems like a reasonable way to spend part of the day." For the next hour, Martha read passages from various books, watching Shadow Walker's reactions carefully. He was particularly interested in descriptions of places he had never seen, especially the ocean and large cities. His questions revealed a mind hungry for knowledge about the world beyond the southwestern deserts he knew so well. "In my people's stories," he told her during one pause, "there are tales of great waters that stretch to the horizon, and people so numerous they live stacked on top of each other in stone mountains. I thought these were just stories, like our tales of spirit beings and magic animals. But your books speak of these things as real. The world is much larger than most people realize, whether they're white or Apache," Martha replied. Thomas used to say that traveling, even through books, made a person wiser by showing them how many different ways there are to live. "Your husband was a wise man. I wish I could have known him as something other than an enemy." The wistful note in Shadow Walker's voice prompted Martha to share more about Thomas than she had with anyone since his death. She told him about their courtship in Kansas, their decision to try homesteading in Arizona territory, and Thomas's dreams of building a ranch that could prosper in the harsh desert environment. He believed this land could support many people if they learned to work with it instead of fighting against it, she explained. He studied the way Apache and other tribes managed to survive here, and he tried to apply those lessons to farming and ranching. Most white settlers see only what they want the land to become, not what it actually is, Shadow Walker observed. They try to make it into the green places they came from, and when it resists, they blame the land instead of their own ignorance. Over the following days, these conversations became a regular part of Martha's routine. She would bring Shadow Walker his meals and spend time talking with him about topics ranging from practical desert survival to abstract questions about the differences between Apache and white cultures. She found him to be an unexpectedly thoughtful conversationalist, someone who challenged her assumptions while remaining respectful of her perspectives. Shadow Walker, for his part, seemed equally intrigued by their discussions. "You think differently than other white people I have encountered," he told her one afternoon. "You ask questions instead of simply assuming you already know the answers. Maybe that's because I'm learning that I don't know as much as I thought I did," Martha admitted. "A week ago, I believed Apache people were all bloodthirsty savages who couldn't be reasoned with. Now I'm having philosophical discussions with an Apache warrior in my own home. It's making me question a lot of things I took for granted. Questioning is the beginning of wisdom. My grandmother used to say that the person who never doubts what he believes is like a tree that never bends in the wind. Eventually, something will come along that breaks him." As Shadow Walker's physical condition improved, Martha found herself facing an increasingly difficult emotional situation. The man she was caring for was intelligent, honorable, and surprisingly gentle despite his reputation as a warrior. He treated her with respect and gratitude, and their conversations had become something she looked forward to rather than endured. At the same time, she was acutely aware that he represented everything she had been taught to fear and hate. He was Apache, a member of the tribe that had killed her husband. He was a warrior who had undoubtedly participated in raids against white settlements. No matter how pleasant their current interactions might be, the reality of their respective positions could not be ignored indefinitely. This internal conflict came to a head on the 7th day of his recovery, when Shadow Walker felt strong enough to stand and walk a few steps around the room. As Martha watched him test his mobility, she realized that their time together was drawing to a close. Soon he would be well enough to leave, and she would have to decide whether to let him go or fulfill what many would consider her duty by turning him over to the authorities. "You are troubled," Shadow Walker observed, settling back onto the cot after his brief exercise. "Your face shows the same expression my sister wore when she was trying to solve a problem with no good solutions." Martha was startled by his perceptiveness. "You have a sister?" "I have 2 sisters and a brother. My parents are both still alive, though they grow old on the reservation. I also have a woman who waits for me, though I do not know if she still considers herself pledged to me after so many months of separation." The casual mention of family and loved ones hit Martha like a physical blow. She had somehow managed to avoid thinking about Shadow Walker as a real person with relationships and responsibilities beyond their small room. Suddenly, she was forced to confront the fact that her decision would affect not just the 2 of them, but all the people who cared about him. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. Shadow Walker's face softened as he spoke about his family. His older sister was a skilled weaver who had tried to adapt traditional Apache techniques to reservation life. His younger sister had married a man from another band and moved away before the troubles escalated. His brother was a scout for the army, a choice that had created tension within the family, but which provided some protection for their parents on the reservation. "And the woman who waits for you?" "Her name is Dancing Hawk. We have been pledged since childhood, but the war has kept us apart for 2 years now. She lives with her family on the reservation and works as a seamstress for the agent's wife. It is not the life either of us had planned, but it is survival." Martha felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, which shocked her with its intensity. She had no right to feel possessive about a man she had known for barely a week, especially one who was already committed to another woman. "Do you love her?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Shadow Walker considered the question seriously before answering. "I care for her greatly, and I honor our pledge. But love, as I think you mean it, requires time and shared experience that we have not had. We were children when our families arranged our betrothal. The woman she has become and the man I have become are strangers to each other." Martha thought about her own marriage to Thomas, which had begun with genuine affection and deepened into love through years of shared struggles and joys. "Thomas and I grew to love each other after we married. Maybe you and Dancing Hawk will too if you have the chance. Perhaps, if we both survive the war, and if the reservation does not break our spirits before we can build a life together." Shadow Walker was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What about you? Will you remain alone on this homestead forever?" "I don't know. I haven't thought much about the future beyond getting through each day. Grief can make the world seem small. But you are young and strong. Surely you do not intend to live your entire life as a widow." The question made Martha uncomfortable, partly because she had been asking herself the same thing lately. There aren't many unmarried men in this territory, and most of the ones who are available aren't the kind of men I would want to marry. "What kind of man would you want?" Martha found herself describing Thomas's qualities, the traits that had made their marriage a happy one despite the hardships they had faced. Intelligence, kindness, courage, the ability to see beyond surface differences to the person underneath. As she spoke, she realized she was also describing Shadow Walker, which created a confusion of feelings she was not prepared to examine closely. "You describe a good man," Shadow Walker said when she finished. "Such men exist among all peoples, though they may be rare everywhere." That evening, as Martha prepared for bed, she found herself facing the reality that Shadow Walker would probably be strong enough to travel within a day or 2. His leg was mending well, and his other wounds had healed enough that they would not prevent him from riding or walking long distances. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the door to his room and trying to force herself to make a decision. The logical choice was clear. She should send word to the nearest army post that she had a wounded Apache warrior in custody. The soldiers would take him away, probably to trial and execution, and her life would return to its previous pattern of lonely routine. But the thought of betraying Shadow Walker's trust felt like a violation of something sacred. He had been completely honest with her about his identity and his intentions. He had made no attempt to escape or threaten her, even when he was strong enough to overpower her. He had shared his thoughts and feelings with remarkable openness, treating her as an equal despite their positions as captor and captive. More troubling still was the growing realization that she had come to care about what happened to him. Somewhere in the past week, he had stopped being a faceless enemy and had become a person whose welfare mattered to her. The thought of him being killed or imprisoned filled her with distress that went far beyond abstract sympathy for a fellow human being. As she finally went to bed that night, Martha admitted to herself what she had been trying to avoid acknowledging. She was falling in love with Shadow Walker, despite everything that should have made such feelings impossible. She loved his intelligence, his dignity, his gentle strength, and the way he challenged her to think beyond the boundaries of her previous experience. The knowledge was both wonderful and terrifying. Wonderful because she had not expected to feel such deep emotion again after Thomas's death. Terrifying because acting on those feelings would require her to abandon everything she had ever known about her place in the world. Tomorrow she would have to decide not just Shadow Walker's fate, but her own as well. The choice would determine whether she remained Martha Henderson, respectable widow and frontier homesteader, or became something entirely new, a woman who had chosen love over convention and mercy over vengeance. As sleep finally came, Martha dreamed of walking through the desert with a tall figure beside her, someone whose face she could not quite see, but whose presence made the harsh landscape seem less forbidding. When she woke at dawn, she knew what her decision would be. Martha woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt since before Thomas's death. The decision she had wrestled with for days was finally clear in her mind, though she knew it would change her life in ways she could barely imagine. As she prepared breakfast, she rehearsed the words she would use to tell Shadow Walker what she had decided. When she entered his room that morning, she found him sitting on the edge of the cot, testing the strength of his injured leg. He had been doing this exercise for several days now, and she could see that his mobility was improving rapidly. The determined expression on his face told her that he was making his own plans for departure. "Your leg is much better," she observed, setting down his breakfast tray. "Yes, I can walk without pain now, and the bone has set properly. I will be able to travel today, if necessary." He looked up at her with an expression that was part gratitude and part resignation. "I know you have been thinking about what to do with me. Have you reached a decision?" Instead of answering directly, Martha sat down in the chair beside his cot. "Before I tell you what I've decided, I want you to answer a question honestly. If I let you go, what will you do? Will you return to raiding and fighting?" Shadow Walker considered the question carefully. "I will return to my people, yes. Whether that means more fighting depends on circumstances beyond my control. The soldiers continue to hunt us, and the reservation authorities make life impossible for those who try to live peacefully. Sometimes fighting is the only choice left, even after what has passed between us, even knowing that there are white people capable of kindness and mercy. What has passed between us gives me hope that someday our peoples might find peace with each other. But I'm only one man, and you are only one woman. The hate and fear on both sides are bigger than what we can change by ourselves." Martha had expected this answer, but hearing it still disappointed her. So nothing that happened here matters in the larger conflict? Everything that happened here matters, but not in the way you might hope. Shadow Walker reached out and gently took her hand, a gesture that sent warmth through her entire body. "You have shown me that white people are capable of seeing Apache as human beings rather than just enemies. I have shown you that Apache can honor kindness even when it comes from unexpected sources. These lessons will stay with both of us forever, regardless of what the future brings." Martha looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural the contact felt despite everything that should have made it impossible. What if there was another choice? What if you didn't have to go back to the fighting? Shadow Walker's eyes sharpened with interest, but also caution. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you stay here, with me." Martha forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "I know how that sounds. I know all the reasons why it's impossible. But I've fallen in love with you, and I think you have feelings for me too. We could make a life together if we had the courage to try." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch forever. Shadow Walker's expression went through several changes as he processed what she had said and considered its implications. Finally, he spoke with a voice full of gentle regret. "Martha, what you offer is more precious than you know. In another world, in other circumstances, I would accept gladly. But we do not live in that other world. We live in this one, where an Apache warrior and a white widow cannot simply decide to love each other without consequences." "What consequences?" "We're adults capable of making our own choices. This is my land, my home. I can invite anyone I want to share it. Your neighbors would never accept it. The soldiers would come for me eventually, and my people would see my choice as betrayal, abandonment of family, and responsibilities. Shadow Walker's grip on her hand tightened. More than that, you would lose everything that makes you who you are. Your place in white society, your respectability, your safety. I cannot ask you to sacrifice so much. Martha had anticipated these objections, and she was prepared for them. My neighbors already think I'm peculiar for staying here alone. The soldiers rarely patrol this area, and if they did come, we could see them long before they reached the house. As for your people, couldn't you send word that you had died from your wounds? Let them think you perished honorably in battle rather than chose exile. You have thought about this carefully. I've thought about little else for days. I know the risks, but I also know that some chances only come once in a lifetime. I lost one good man to this war already. I don't want to lose another by being too afraid to take a risk. Shadow Walker was quiet for a long time, staring out the small window at the desert landscape beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with longing and conflict. You do not understand what you are asking. Among my people, I am considered a war leader, someone others look to for guidance and courage. My family expects me to return and help them navigate the difficulties of reservation life. Dancing Hawk waits for me, as do the responsibilities I accepted when I chose the warrior's path. And what about what you want? What about your own happiness? Happiness is a luxury warriors cannot always afford. Duty and honor must come first. Martha felt a flare of anger at his response. That's what Thomas used to say. Duty before happiness. Honor before personal desires. It got him killed trying to protect people who weren't even his responsibility. Your husband died honorably, defending innocence. Surely you would not wish he had acted differently. No, I'm proud of what he did. But I also know that honor without happiness makes for a cold life. Thomas learned that lesson too late to change anything, but you still have a choice. Shadow Walker turned to look at her directly, and Martha saw the internal struggle playing out in his dark eyes. What you offer tempts me more than you know. These days we have spent together have shown me a kind of peace I had forgotten was possible. Your kindness, your intelligence, your courage all draw me like water draws a man dying of thirst. Then, why are you fighting it? Because love without honor becomes selfish desire. Because choosing my own happiness over my responsibilities would make me less than the man you think you love. The conversation continued for most of the morning, with Martha pressing her case and Shadow Walker explaining the cultural and personal obligations that made her proposal seem impossible to him. Yet beneath his reasonable objections, she could sense the temptation her offer represented. He wanted to stay with her as much as she wanted him to stay. By midday, they had reached an impasse. Shadow Walker insisted he had to return to his people, while Martha argued that he owed himself the chance at happiness she was offering. The discussion had become heated at times, but always remained respectful, both of them recognizing that the other's position had merit even while disagreeing with it. It was Shadow Walker who, finally, proposed a compromise. There's a middle path we have not discussed. What if you came with me? Martha was so surprised by the suggestion that she could only stare at him. Come with you where? To my people. Not to the reservation, but to the free Apache who still live in the mountains. It would be dangerous, and you would have to leave this life entirely behind. But it would allow us to be together without requiring me to abandon my responsibilities. The idea was so radical that Martha needed several minutes to fully consider it. Leave her home, her culture, her entire identity to live as an Apache woman in the wilderness? It seemed impossible, yet as she thought about it, she realized it was no more impossible than asking Shadow Walker to abandon his people and live as a white man. Would your people accept me? It would be difficult at first. There's great anger among my people toward all whites. But there are precedents for women from other tribes joining us through marriage, and, over time, those who prove their loyalty are accepted. You have already shown courage and kindness that my people would respect once they got to know you. What kind of life would it be? Hard. Dangerous. We live always on the move, always watching for soldiers. Food and water are often scarce. Comfort and safety are rare luxuries. It would be nothing like the life you have known. Martha thought about her current existence on the homestead. Days of grinding routine, nights of crushing loneliness, the constant awareness that her life was essentially over at 26 years old. My life here isn't exactly easy or safe either, but it is familiar. What I offer is completely unknown. For the rest of the afternoon, they discussed the practical aspects of what Shadow Walker's proposal would mean. He painted an honest picture of Apache life in the mountains, neither romanticizing the hardships nor minimizing the dangers they would face. Martha asked detailed questions about everything from daily survival routines to the complex social structures of Apache society. As evening approached, Martha realized they had spent the entire day planning a future together without either of them officially agreeing to it. The conversation had shifted from whether they could be together to how they would manage it, as if the decision had been made through the simple act of exploring possibilities. "When would we leave?" Martha asked as she prepared his dinner. "Soon. The longer I remain in one place, the greater the chance of discovery. And winter will come to the mountains before long. It is better to establish ourselves with my people before the cold season makes travel difficult." Martha looked around her small house, at the possessions she and Thomas had accumulated during their years together. "I can't take much with me. Very little. Only what you can carry in a pack, and only things that would be useful in the mountains. Everything else would have to be left behind." The enormity of what she was contemplating hit Martha all at once. She would be leaving behind not just her house and belongings, but her entire identity. Martha Henderson, respectable frontier widow, would cease to exist. In her place would be a white woman living among Apache, accepted or rejected based entirely on her own actions and character. "Are you certain you want this?" Shadow Walker asked gently. "Once we leave here together, there can be no changing your mind and returning to your old life." Martha thought about the question seriously, examining her motivations and fears with complete honesty. Yes, she was afraid. Yes, she was taking an enormous risk. But she was also choosing life over mere survival, love over loneliness, adventure over the slow death of her spirit that continued isolation represented. "I'm certain," she said finally. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow night. We will travel in darkness for the first several days, until we are far enough from the settlements to be relatively safe from pursuit." Martha nodded, then began making mental lists of what she would need to do to prepare. Practical arrangements for her livestock and property, decisions about what few possessions she could take. Most importantly, she would need to write letters explaining her disappearance, letters that would be found after she was gone and would hopefully prevent massive search efforts. That evening, as they made final plans for their departure, Martha felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration unlike anything she had experienced since her wedding day. She was about to step off the edge of the known world into something completely unprecedented, guided only by love and faith in the man who had changed her life in the space of a single week. "No matter what happens," she told Shadow Walker as she prepared to leave his room for the last time, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for the choice you've given me. Even if everything goes wrong, at least I'll have tried to live instead of just existing. And I'm grateful for the gift you have given me. You have shown me that mercy can be stronger than hatred, and that love can bloom even in the harshest ground." Shadow Walker reached for her hand one more time. "Tomorrow we begin a new story together, one that neither of our peoples could have imagined possible." As Martha fell asleep for the last time in her own bed, she dreamed not of the past she was leaving behind, but of the uncertain future she was choosing to embrace. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of an adventure that would test everything she thought she knew about herself, her courage, and the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Martha spent the next day in a strange state of controlled chaos, preparing for a journey that would take her away from everything she had ever known. She moved through her house like a woman possessed, sorting through possessions and memories, deciding what could be taken and what would have to be abandoned forever. The practical preparations were surprisingly complex. She needed clothing suitable for mountain travel, but not so obviously different from her normal attire that it would attract attention if anyone visited unexpectedly. She gathered her medical supplies, knowing that her healing knowledge would be valuable among Shadow Walker's people. She selected a few precious items that connected her to Thomas, including his watch and their wedding photograph, small reminders of the love that had shaped her life before this new love transformed it again. Most difficult was writing the letters that would explain her disappearance without revealing the truth. She composed a note to her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Richardson, claiming that she had decided to return to Kansas to live with relatives. Another letter went to the territorial authorities, formally abandoning her claim to the homestead. These deceptions troubled her conscience, but she could see no alternative that would not endanger both herself and Shadow Walker. As she worked, Shadow Walker remained in his room, partly to avoid being seen by any unexpected visitors and partly to give Martha space to complete her emotional farewell to her old life. When she checked on him periodically, she found him either resting to build strength for the arduous journey ahead or quietly observing the desert landscape through the small window. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked during one of these visits, noticing the contemplative expression on his face. "I'm thinking about the magnitude of what we are attempting," he replied honestly. "I'm taking a white woman into Apache territory during a time of war. You are abandoning everything familiar to live among people who have every reason to view you with suspicion. We are both taking risks that could easily cost us our lives. But you're not changing your mind?" Shadow Walker turned from the window to look at her directly. "No, the risks are real, but so is the alternative. If we part ways now, I will spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. That kind of regret is its own form of death." As evening approached, Martha completed her final preparations. She had packed a single canvas bag with the essentials she could carry, hidden supplies of water and food for the first part of their journey, and arranged her remaining possessions to suggest she had left in an orderly fashion rather than fled in panic. The hardest moment came when she visited Thomas's grave on the hill behind the house. She knelt beside the simple wooden cross he had carved and told him about the choice she was making. Whether he could somehow hear her words or not, she felt the need to explain why she was leaving him behind for another man. "I know this isn't what either of us expected," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "But you always told me that life was for the living, and that love was too precious to waste on fear. I think you would understand, and I hope you would forgive me for finding happiness again." A gentle breeze stirred the desert grasses around the grave, and Martha chose to interpret it as Thomas's blessing on her new beginning. She said a final goodbye to the man who had given her 5 years of happiness and the strength to recognize love when she found it again. When full darkness fell, Shadow Walker emerged from the house dressed in travel clothes Martha had found among Thomas's belongings. The transformation was remarkable. In Apache garments, he had looked every inch the warrior he was. In white man's clothing, he could almost pass for a settler or ranch hand, at least in poor light or at a distance. "The first part of our journey will be the most dangerous," he explained as they made final checks of their supplies. "We need to put as many miles as possible between ourselves and this area before dawn. Once we reach the mountains, we will be safer, but also entering territory where I will need to contact my people carefully." They set out walking northward, avoiding the established trails that might be watched by army patrols or frequented by other travelers. Shadow Walker moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned to travel unseen, and he taught Martha to place her feet carefully to minimize noise and avoid leaving obvious tracks. The first night's travel was grueling. Martha was in good physical condition from her homesteading work, but she was not accustomed to walking long distances over rough terrain in darkness. Her feet developed blisters, her legs ached, and several times she stumbled over rocks or holes she could not see properly. Yet she forced herself to keep pace with Shadow Walker, knowing that their safety depended on covering ground quickly. When they finally stopped to rest near dawn, they had traveled nearly 20 miles into increasingly rugged country. Shadow Walker led her to a small cave hidden among tumbled rocks where they could rest during the day without being easily spotted by chance observers. "How do you feel?" he asked as Martha collapsed gratefully onto the sandy cave floor. "Like I've been run over by a freight wagon," she admitted. "But I'll manage. How much farther before we reach your people?" "Many days of travel, but the worst part is behind us. Each mile we go deeper into the mountains makes us safer from pursuit and closer to Apache territory." They rested during the hot daylight hours and traveled again the next night. This pattern continued for a week, with Martha gradually adapting to the physical demands of their journey. Shadow Walker proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to move quietly, how to read signs in the landscape, and how to find water in places that looked completely barren. On the 8th night, Shadow Walker announced that they were entering territory where they might encounter Apache scouts. "From now on, you must let me handle any contacts with my people. Some of them will shoot first and ask questions later if they see a white person in these mountains. Martha felt a chill of fear at his words, but she tried to hide her nervousness. What should I do if we meet them? Stay behind me and remain silent unless I specifically ask you to speak. I will explain our situation, but it may take time for them to accept it. Apache warriors are suspicious of anything unusual, and a white woman traveling willingly with one of their own is definitely unusual. The next morning brought their first contact with Shadow Walker's people. Martha woke to find him in quiet conversation with two Apache men who had apparently approached their camp while she slept. The discussion was conducted entirely in Apache, but she could tell from the tones and gestures that the conversation was serious and somewhat tense. After perhaps 20 minutes, Shadow Walker returned to where Martha waited nervously. They are scouts from my band. They recognized me and are surprised to find me alive, since word had reached them that I was killed in the fight with the soldiers. They are also very curious about you. What did you tell them? The truth. That you saved my life and that we have chosen to be together. They are not entirely convinced, but they have agreed to escort us to the main camp so the elders can evaluate the situation. The two scouts maintained a careful distance as they led Martha and Shadow Walker deeper into the mountains. Martha could feel their eyes on her constantly, evaluating everything from the way she walked to how she responded to the increasingly difficult terrain. She sensed that she was being tested, though she was not sure what criteria were being applied. Late that afternoon, they reached a hidden valley where perhaps 40 Apache people had established a temporary camp. Martha's arrival created an immediate sensation. Children stared openly at her pale skin and unusual clothing. Women whispered among themselves, some with curiosity and others with obvious suspicion. The men examined her with the calculating gaze of warriors assessing a potential threat. Shadow Walker was greeted with joy by his family members, who had indeed believed him dead. But their celebration was tempered by concern about the white woman he had brought with him. Martha understood none of the rapid Apache conversation that swirled around them, but she could read body language well enough to know that her presence was controversial. The resolution came when an elderly woman approached the gathering and spoke sharply to the crowd. Her obvious authority caused the others to step back and give her space to examine Martha directly. The old woman walked slowly around Martha, studying her from every angle with bright, intelligent eyes. Finally, the elder spoke to Shadow Walker in accented but clear English. So this is the white woman who saved your life. Yes, grandmother. This is Martha Henderson. She chose to leave her people to be with me. The old woman's gaze was so intense that Martha felt as if her soul was being examined. Why did you help him? White women do not show mercy to Apache warriors. Martha found her voice despite her nervousness. He was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just let him die. Many white people would say you should have done exactly that. Why are you different? I don't know if I'm different. I just did what felt right at the time. The elder continued her questioning for several more minutes, asking about Martha's motivations, her understanding of Apache culture, and her commitment to the difficult life she was choosing. Shadow Walker translated when necessary, but Martha could tell that the old woman understood English better than she initially let on. Finally, the elder stepped back and made a pronouncement in Apache that caused a ripple of reaction through the gathered crowd. Shadow Walker's face showed relief, while several of the women nodded approvingly. What did she say? Martha asked quietly. She said that your spirit is strong and your heart is honest. She believes you can learn to be Apache if you're willing to work hard and accept instruction. The decision about whether you can stay will ultimately be made by the war chief, but grandmother's endorsement carries great weight. Over the next several days, Martha began her introduction to Apache life in earnest. The women of the band took charge of her education, teaching her everything from how to prepare traditional foods to the complex social relationships that govern daily interactions. Some of them were kind and patient teachers, while others remained skeptical and watchful. Shadow Walker's grandmother, whose name was Morningstar, became Martha's primary mentor. Despite her advanced age, the old woman possessed remarkable energy and a sharp wit that kept Martha constantly on her toes. She spoke excellent English when she chose to, the result of many years of dealing with government officials and traders, but she insisted that Martha begin learning Apache immediately. You cannot be Apache in your heart if you cannot speak with Apache words, Morningstar explained. Language carries the spirit of a people. To truly belong here, you must think in our way, not just act in our way. The language lessons were frustrating at first. Apache was unlike any language Martha had ever encountered, with complex verb forms and subtle tonal variations that could completely change meaning. But Morningstar was a patient teacher, and Martha's determination to succeed gradually began showing results. More challenging than the language was learning to navigate the intricate web of relationships and customs that governed Apache society. Every interaction carried layers of meaning related to family connections, social status, and historical relationships between different groups. Martha had to learn not just how to behave, but why those behaviors mattered and what they communicated about her respect for Apache traditions. The physical demands of Apache life were also considerable. The band moved frequently to avoid army patrols and to follow seasonal resources. Martha learned to pack and unpack the entire camp quickly, to carry heavy loads over difficult terrain, and to find comfort and rest under conditions that would have seemed impossible during her homesteading days. Shadow Walker helped when he could, but he also had his own responsibilities to fulfill. As a returning warrior, he was immediately called upon to participate in planning sessions with the other men, to share intelligence about army movements he had observed, and to take his place in the band's defensive arrangements. Martha often saw him only briefly during the day, though they spent their evenings together when possible. 3 weeks after their arrival, the war chief finally called Martha to a formal meeting where her future with the band would be decided. The session took place around a council fire, with all the adult members of the band present to hear the discussion and contribute their opinions. The war chief was a man named Iron Hawk, whose scarred face and missing left hand testified to a lifetime of fighting. He questioned Martha extensively about her motivations, her commitment to Apache ways, and her understanding of the danger she would face as a white woman living among them. "The soldiers will never stop hunting us," he told her bluntly. "If you're captured with us, they will assume you were taken against your will. They will try to rescue you and kill any Apache who try to protect you. Are you prepared to die rather than return to the white world?" Martha thought carefully before answering. "I hope it never comes to that choice, but yes. I would rather die free among people I care about than live safely among people who no longer understand who I am." Iron Hawk studied her face for a long moment, then turned to address the gathered band. The discussion that followed was entirely in Apache, but Martha could tell from the tones and occasional gestures in her direction that opinions were divided. Some voices were clearly supportive, while others expressed skepticism or concern. After nearly an hour of debate, Iron Hawk called for silence and made his decision. "You may stay," he told Martha, "but you will be watched closely, and any sign that you cannot adapt to our ways or that you pose a danger to the band will result in your removal." The relief Martha felt was overwhelming, but she managed to maintain the composed demeanor that Apache culture demanded. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't disappoint you." That night, Shadow Walker came to her with news that filled in the final piece of their new life together. "Iron Hawk has agreed to perform a marriage ceremony for us according to Apache custom. If you're to be truly one of us, you should be properly married, not just living together." The wedding took place a week later, under a full moon in a ceremony that was completely unlike Martha's first marriage to Thomas. There were no churches or ministers, no formal vows or wedding dress. Instead, there were ancient rituals involving the sharing of corn pollen, prayers to the four directions, and the binding of their hands with strips of hide while the entire band sang traditional songs. As she stood beside Shadow Walker under the star-filled sky, Martha reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a lonely widow, slowly dying of isolation and grief. Now she was a new bride, beginning an entirely different life among people who had once been her enemies. The transformation had not been easy, and she knew there would be many more challenges ahead. Life with the Apache would always be dangerous and uncertain. She would probably never see her old home or any white people again. The woman she had been was gone forever, replaced by someone she was still learning to become. But as Shadow Walker squeezed her hand and smiled at her in the firelight, Martha felt a deep contentment she had never expected to experience again. She had chosen love over fear, adventure over safety, and life over mere survival. Whatever the future held, she would face it with a partner who valued her courage and cherished her spirit. The morning after their wedding, the band broke camp and moved deeper into the mountains, following paths known only to Apache guides and leading toward a future that none of them could predict. Martha Henderson, now known by her Apache name White Dove, walked beside her husband into that uncertain future with her head held high and her heart full of hope. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly toward the settlements where her old life had ended. Ahead lay the mountains and canyons where her new life would unfold, shaped by choices that had seemed impossible just weeks before, but had proven to be the most natural decision she had ever made. In the years that followed, White Dove would become a respected member of her adopted people, a healer and storyteller whose courage in leaving the white world became legend among the Apache. Her marriage to Shadow Walker would produce children who bridged two worlds, and her own story would be told around countless fires as an example of how love could triumph over hatred and fear. But all of that lay in the future. For now, there was only the morning sun on the mountains, the steady rhythm of walking, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had chosen to live fully rather than simply exist safely. In a world torn by conflict between her birth people and her chosen people, Martha Henderson had found a way to honor both her past and her future, creating something new and precious from the ashes of old hatreds and ancient fears.